Okay, hi everybody. How is everybody this afternoon? Yes, it's warm outside. But I complained about how hot it was in my office, so now I'm freezing in my office. So you kind of have to be careful what you wish for too. I wish it was this cool in my house at home. Okay, I did want to announce to you guys. First of all, I made an error at the end of last week's lecture session. We're doing Module 5 and Module 6, and then we are not doing Module 7. I deleted Module 7 from the course modules page, but it still left the discussion board up. And so somebody had asked about, and I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and let people do Module 7 if they want to for extra credit. I'm not going to post a PowerPoint or do a lecture or anything, but if people want to kind of read through the chapter and want to post something to the discussion board, then they can do that. So I'm going to post something on the course shell, probably post an announcement and post something in that discussion board, so that if people want to do that for up to 10 points extra credit, then they can do that, but that's not going to be required. So since it left it in the discussion, I deleted it from the module, I thought that might be, I'll just leave it up, and whoever wants to do it for extra credit, they have that opportunity. So I also wanted to point that out. So this will be our last PowerPoint, and then this will be our last lecture. And what I need to do is make sure that I get the test up, and I'm going to follow the revised syllabus schedule that I put under the syllabus tab. And finals are still supposed to be August 1 through 6. Or August 1st and 2nd. I was looking at Module 6 on my screen when I said that. Finals are supposed to be August 1st and 2nd, and so that won't change. I'll have to check on that, Danielle. She's telling me that there doesn't appear to be anything attached for the Module 6 assignment. So let me write myself a note, and I will see what we need to do for that. That's probably just an oversight on my part, so I'll make sure that that's up. I'm glad that you told me that. So Chapter 16 and Chapter 17 are talking about some things related to communities and populations and ecosystems. If you go back to our very first figure that we looked at, that we said was going to be kind of a roadmap for our semester, the levels of organization figure, which was figure 1.2. We started out by doing the atoms and the molecules and the cells. Then we talked about some things related to organisms, especially like the genetics and the inheritance and how to pass things from one generation to the next. And now we're getting into populations and communities and ecosystems. And then the next chapter gets into biosphere, which is the stuff that I'm going to let you guys kind of do independently if you're interested in doing that. And so a lot of people find that this part of the material makes a little more sense to them in Bio 112 because it, you can see groups of animals, you can see communities and ecosystems, and it just kind of tends to be a little more impactful for people, especially after studying the atoms and the cells and the molecules and those kinds of things. But you'll see as we go through this that we're going to kind of refer back to some of the things that we did in those previous chapters. So like everything else, we're kind of building on some of the early chapters. Another figure from Chapter 1 that you may want to go back and take a look at is figure 1.3 on page 6. That's the figure with producers and consumers and sunlight energy. We've seen that a couple of times, and that's actually one of the things that I want to focus a little bit on in the lecture today. So, Chapter 16 gives a lot of different things about populations and communities. Talks a little bit about populations growing and ways that populations can grow, and gives some things about shaping communities, which is an area where different populations are living. And some of this you may have studied before. For example, the terms on symbiosis. If both parties benefit versus if one party benefits versus if it's a parasite, if the other party is actually damaged. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going through some of that stuff because that may be stuff that you've already seen before, but it's going to be some things that you can kind of look at the terms in the chapter and kind of pick those things up. What I wanted to look at was some of the stuff from Chapter 17 that kind of relies on some of what we've studied in the past, and so that I can hopefully kind of help make some of those connections between what we've studied before and what I just really want to point out the significance of some of the things in Chapter 17 and how they relate to some of the things that we've previously studied. So, I want to start out by looking at some of the terms that they introduced in that first figure, in Figure 1.3 in Chapter 1, and they show you a very similar figure in Figure 17.14 that we're going to look at in just a second. But they go through that first paragraph on page, or that first section on page 350, giving you the definitions of some of these terms that they're going to use. And so I want to go through and do some of those definitions so that when I use a term like producer, then it kind of makes sense what I'm talking about. So in this section, they're talking about ecosystems, and they're going to be talking about the flow of energy through an ecosystem. And we've kind of hit on this just briefly when we've said things like, when you're hungry, you don't go sit outside in the sunshine. You eat a plant, or you eat an animal that ate a plant. What we're talking about is where you get energy from, where that food energy comes from. And what happens in these ecosystems is that light energy gets converted to energy in chemical bonds, and then we can release the energy in those chemical bonds for work and for heat and those kinds of things. So energy flows one way, a single direction, through an ecosystem. While nutrients can cycle through an ecosystem, energy only flows one way. Energy cannot be recycled. And energy usually starts with sunlight. And so the first part of what we're going to talk about is energy cycling, and then we can talk about other materials like nutrients, carbon, and water, and those kinds of things, and how they cycle between organisms in their environment. And the basic reason why energy flows one way through a system, your book explains in one of those paragraphs, is that producers cannot go the other direction. They cannot convert heat into chemical bond energy. They can only convert light into chemical bond energy. So as we go through and look at this figure in just a second, we're going to start by talking about producers. Producers are kind of at the bottom of the food chain, we sometimes say, but they convert sunlight energy into chemical bond energy. They can capture that sunlight energy, and they can store it in a way that we can then convert it to chemical bond energy. They make their own food, that's why they're called producers, from inorganic materials in the environment. So what they're doing is they are using CO2, and they are using light, and they are producing things like glucose that has energy stored in its chemical bond. And then we can get the energy out of glucose in glycolysis and those reactions and use that energy for making ATP and then using ATP for different things in the cell. Then consumers consume the producers. They eat other organisms or sometimes the remains of other organisms. And so if you're not a producer, you're a consumer. If you're not producing the nutrients, you're consuming the nutrients. Detritivores are consumers that feed on the detritus. These are going to be things that are, animals that have died that are breaking down on small bits of organic material. And then decomposers feed on remains and break them into inorganic building blocks. They help to return the nutrients to the environment where the producers are going to take them up again, and so this is going to be part of the nutrient cycling. But they do not return any energy to the environment. They just return nutrients to the environment. So while they are involved in a nutrient cycle, again, energy flow is unidirectional. And so that's what this figure shows. This figure is showing energy can only move in a single direction through the layers, but the nutrients can cycle through the layers from consumers to producers. And so what we mean when we talk about producers are organisms that can make their own food source, organisms that can convert light into food, or that can convert light into the energy and chemical bond. And what we mean by consumers are animals or organisms that consume producers, organisms that eat other organisms, organisms that use the energy in those chemical bonds to do the work that they need to. And then all of these can give off heat energy. We're going to talk about how the energy that is transferred from level to level here is very inefficient. A lot of it is lost as heat energy, so we're going to talk about that in just a second. So I also want to point out to you the middle paragraph that's on page 350 is got some good summary. So the third paragraph that starts with light energy gives you a really good summary of what's going on. Light energy captured by producers is converted to chemical bond energy in organic molecules. And that chemical bond energy is then released by metabolic reactions. And those give off heat. So it's a one-way process that's not recycled because everything gets transferred to heat, and heat cannot be then remade into chemical bond energy. So that's a really good sentence to try to summarize some of what we're talking about here. And the other thing that I like about it is that it alludes to some of the things that we talked about previously as far as metabolic reactions, breaking down glucose and other types of metabolic reactions to get the energy out. We can cull that energy off of glucose molecules, and we can get that energy out and use that energy for cell work, for muscle contraction in humans or for cells moving chemotaxis to try to find food. So the next kind of concept we can try to talk about as we kind of build some of this information is the idea of trophic level. And a trophic level, trophic means food or nutrient. So the trophic level is what nourishment level an organism is at. So it's the position of an organism in a food chain. Are they low on the food chain or are they high on the food chain? What is their trophic level? And as you go up in trophic level, you get farther away from the energy source. So if we look at this figure, what that means is as we get farther away, as we get farther away from the energy source, as we add levels of consumers, we get farther away from those producers, which are capturing the light energy, which is the energy source for this ecosystem. So the energy source for that ecosystem usually is going to be sunlight. And so the producers are closest to the sunlight. And then you'll have a consumer and a second consumer that eats those producers. And the further away, the further up those trophic levels you get, the further away you are from the energy source for that ecosystem. So anything that's on this trophic level is going to be the same number of steps away from the energy source. And so we can put all these together in a food chain. A food chain is a sequence of steps that transfers the energy captured by the producers to higher and higher and higher consumers. And a food chain is going to be linear, and it's basically a description of what eats what, whom eats whom. And this is an example of a food chain that they show you in your book. And so the producer here is grass. Grass has chlorophyll. Grass can undergo photosynthesis and convert light energy into food energy. And then the first thing that eats the grass is a grasshopper. Grasshoppers are insects that eat grass. Then there's a bird, a small bird, a sparrow. Sparrows eat grasshoppers. And then there are larger birds, hawks. Hawks are carnivores. They eat sparrows. They fly around in the air, and when they see a sparrow land, they fly down and they grab it. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be landed. And grab them out of thin air. And so this is the food chain. So as it labels, the grass is a producer, and then all of these other organisms are consumers. And we label what level they are. So the grasshopper is a primary consumer because it is eating the producer. A second level and a third level consumer in this arrangement. And so at the top of the figure, they tell you what trophic level we're at. The producers are at the first trophic level. They are closest to the energy source. They're the ones that are actually converting the sunlight into glucose. The second trophic level is going to be the closest of the consumers to the energy source, because it's the consumer that's eating the producer, and so on and so on. So when we say, when we're hungry, we don't sit in the sunshine, because we're not grass, we're not a plant. We don't have the chlorophyll that can convert light energy into food energy. we eat a plant or we eat an animal that ate a plant. When I say that sentence, I'm saying we function as primary or second level or sometimes even third level consumers. We would be primary consumers if we eat a plant. We would be second level consumers if we eat an animal that ate a plant. Now we can look at food webs that shows an interconnected way of looking at all of the consumers and producers in an ecosystem. And so they give you some definitions of things like grazing food chains, energy flows from producers to large herbivores, in detrital food chains, energy from producers flows to decomposers and detritivores. But what we're talking about, this is a figure from your book. It's on page 351 in your book. And it's showing at the bottom, it shows the first trophic level. It's showing grasses and plants and flowers that have the means of converting sunlight energy into food energy. The second trophic level are small consumers. They're mostly herbivores, meaning they eat the plant, and so they are going to eat those plants that are the producers. And so that's that second trophic level. These are primary consumers. And then you have higher trophic levels, which are going to be the carnivores that either eat the herbivores or they're going to eat other carnivores that ate the herbivores. So either they're going to eat the animals that ate the plants or they're going to eat an animal that ate an animal that ate a plant. And so the next part of the chapter goes in and talks about the energy related to this. So we're talking about the energy transfers between these trophic levels. So as these consumers eat producers or consumers eat other consumers, we're transferring energy, and we're talking about that energy transfer here. And one characteristic of that is that it's very, very inefficient. Somewhere else in your book, it talks about only about 10% of the energy in the tissues of an organism at one level ends up in the next level. You only get 10%. 90% of the energy that's in that organism is lost because energy transfer is very inefficient. Most of that is because not all the parts of that organism are going to be digestible. And part of that is because part of our metabolism is to produce heat, and that heat, as we said, is lost. So those are a couple of reasons why the energy transfers are really inefficient. Most ecosystems support no more than just a few trophic levels. So maybe a carnivore eats the herbivore that ate the grass. Maybe a carnivore eats another carnivore that ate an herbivore that ate the grass. But you're not going to have enough energy to be able to support life getting more than just a few trophic levels away from the source of energy for that ecosystem. So primary production is the capture and storage of energy by producers. That rate is going to vary with the climate and the season, how much sunlight is available, what's the ambient temperature. If trees, deciduous trees, are one of the biggest producers in an ecosystem, well, those trees shed their leaves. They are not producing much food energy in the winter months. So climate and season have an effect on how much food energy is being produced. And we can put this idea into diagrams to show how much energy is captured by producers as they reach those higher trophic levels. And they show you an example on page 358. I don't have that figure to show you, but it shows producers at the bottom, herbivores, which are the primary consumers as the next level up, and then carnivores, and then if there's top carnivores. And so in the summary on page 358, the top of the left-hand column, it shows you a summary energy diagram. It shows you what we're talking about when we're talking about these energy pyramids. And so here's where I tell you that on average only about 10% of the energy in tissue ends up at the next level because of this inefficient energy transfer. And so on page 358, they give you that example, that very generic figure. Here in figure 1717 on page 352, they kind of give you a specific instance that they're looking at. So the numbers that they give you here is the energy in kilocalories per square meter per year. So all the producers in this area in 1 year produce this much kilocalories per square meter. But the herbivores that eat the producers only end up with this much kilocalories. Then the carnivores that eat those herbivores end up with even less energy, and the top carnivores end up with still less, only 21 kilocalories compared to the 20,000, almost 21,000 that was made originally by the producers. So to support the top carnivores in this ecosystem, we have to have this much energy made by producers. That same amount of energy can support this many herbivores. So this just helps to show how inefficient energy transfer is and why food chains typically don't extend for more than a few links or more than a few levels. So on page 352 in your book, the last paragraph under that section, under the section that's talking about this primary production and inefficient energy transfer, when people promote a vegetarian diet by touting the ecological benefits of, quote, eating lower on the food chain, they are referring to the inefficiency of energy transfer between plants and livestock and humans. When a person eats a plant, he or she gets all the available calories in that plant. But if that plant food goes through livestock, only a small percentage of that energy that was available ends up in the meat that the person eats. Thus, feeding a population of meat eaters requires far greater crop production than sustaining a population of vegetarians. And so here, if we go back to this figure and look, the same number of producers could support this many herbivores or this many top carnivores. And so that's what they're saying is more people can be sustained if they eat the primary producers than if that goes through all these energy levels and you lose 90% of the energy at each energy level. More people can be sustained on the same amount of producers, or much more producers to sustain the same number of meat eaters or top carnivores versus the same number of herbivores. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of times people talk about how it's better for the earth or the environment if you eat a vegetarian diet, because not as much plant product has to be grown because of the energy loss in each level before it gets to the top consumers. Now, unfortunately, there's something that is the opposite effect that's called bioaccumulation or biological magnification. And this has to do with toxic chemicals. Toxic chemicals also move up the trophic level, but because they get stored in fat, they can become increasingly concentrated. So this is actually very efficiently transferred from level to level and can increase in concentration the more you eat. And one example is top predators with high mercury level, because the mercury that's in each of the lower consuming animals stays in the fat and still remains dissolved even as it gets to the top consumers. And that's called bioaccumulation, how you accumulate toxic chemicals by eating more and more and more of the consumers that have eaten the toxic chemicals. Organic food is not necessarily more easily digestible. Organic just refers to whether or not the food was grown with pesticides. So it's not going to have anything to do with how digestible it is, but it's going to have to do with this bioaccumulation concept. So pesticides also can dissolve in fat, and as we eat, so if a cow ate grass that was treated with pesticides, and then we eat the cow, we still get all those pesticides that was in the cow's body. So in that way, it's not going to matter whether we directly eat the pesticide-laden grass or we eat a cow that ate pesticide-laden grass. You're still going to accumulate the pesticide if it dissolves in fat and stays in the body and is not excreted. Where the organic moniker started was people wanted to advertise that they grew their food without using those chemicals that would be bioaccumulated. Unfortunately, the term organic is not regulated in such a way that that's what it really means. Basically, organic means the same thing that natural means, which, lots of people can put natural on packaging, and it doesn't mean what people think it means a lot of the time. So that's why there's a movement to, first of all, regulate what can be labeled organic by the FDA, but also a move toward people trying to buy things at farmers markets or through grocery chains that have more standards on not selling pesticide-grown food. And that's also why a lot of people are trying to find meat products where the grains that the animals were fed was not used in pesticides because of this bioaccumulation issue. So a lot of times if you go to Whole Foods and they'll talk about they have different levels of classifying their meat, and they will classify meat that was never fed any pesticides and those kinds of things. It's because they're trying to address this bioaccumulation concern that a lot of people have. Now, we said that energy cycling was very inefficient. We said that because only 10% of it gets into the next level of the food chain, and because of this inefficiency of any energy transfer, and because energy gets converted to heat, it does not recycle. It only goes in one direction. But nutrients that stay as actual nutrients can cycle. This is the figure that I'm looking for. So while energy moves one way through this system, materials that stay actually in their atomic form as materials can cycle through this food web from the producers to the consumers and to the environment and back again. And so we're talking about elemental things like carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen. And the other one that we'll talk about is the water cycle. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about these nutrient cycling systems. And that's why it's different from energy, because energy is being converted to different things. We're converting light to chemicals to heat energy. We can't convert it back the other way. But when we're talking about the nutrient cycling, these nutrients stay in their elemental form. So water and nutrients can move from producers to consumers to the environment and then back to producers again. And a lot of times that happens because it gets into the water or the ground or the environment, and then it gets into the plants. The animals eat the plant, so it goes through the producer, it goes through the consumers as a food web, and then as they decay and as their bodies, it gets back into the ground or the environment. And so your book actually goes through each of these cycles. We can talk about the water cycle. All living organisms require water because water is a cofactor in all of those metabolic reactions. Water is required for photosynthesis to occur. Water is required for the aqueous environment inside humans that we've talked about briefly. And so the water cycle use blue, so we're talking about the water cycle. So water moves from the ocean into the atmosphere. And it can stay in the atmosphere as crystals and vapor, but then a lot of times it will fall as precipitation, rain or snow, and can flow back into the ocean. Solar energy drives that evaporation from ocean into the atmosphere. And then also plants can release water through transpiration that help it get into the atmosphere. But then it's going to fall back down as precipitation, as rain or snow. Now, there's a whole lot of water on our planet, but the majority of the water on our planet is salt water. Some organisms can use salt water. Humans cannot really drink concentrated salt water because of issues with osmosis and water balance with kidneys, and there's a lot that goes into that. Some of that you'll understand because of our discussions about osmosis. Some of that you need to know a little bit more about kidneys and hormones and human physiology. But just suffice it to say that humans need fresh water. Humans cannot directly consume salt water to get the water that we need into our body. So that's why your book talks about where the fresh water is. Only 3% of the water on the surface of the earth is fresh, and most of that is locked in glaciers. And then a lot of times when glaciers melt, that water goes into the ocean, which is salt water. So only less than 1% of it is in lakes and rivers and marshes. Some of it is in aquifers under the ground, and that's where we get our drinking water from. It's a porous rock layer that holds the groundwater. So this is the figure that your book shows you about the water cycle. And so transpiration from plants and evaporation from the ocean puts the water vapor into the atmosphere, and then you get precipitation either back into the ocean or onto the land, and that surface water flows back into the ocean. So the ocean becomes a huge reservoir of the water in this water cycle. So you can see that it cycles between the ocean and the atmosphere and the land, and as it falls on the land, then that's how it can get into plants, and as it's consumed from groundwater, that's how it can get into humans and other animals and organisms. Phosphorus is pretty important. It forms the backbone of DNA, and we store phosphorus in bones. And also the P in ATP means phosphorus. So the phosphorus cycle is kind of important. A lot of the phosphorus is in the Earth's crust, rocks, and soil. It can get into deposits that are shown in this figure under marine sediments around number 3. But where the biological portion of the cycle is shown in the figure, I'm not even showing you the figure, I'm talking about it. The biological portion is shown here, where we uptake phosphates from the soil by producers, and then the consumers eat the producers, and then it can be returned by death and decomposition to those phosphates. And so that's where the producers and the consumers are involved in the phosphorus cycle. Now, I think this figure is kind of interesting because what they're showing you here is that if you have too much phosphate that goes into seawater, then you can encourage the growth of plants like algae. And so what they're showing you here is 2 areas of water that have been separated. This side, phosphorus has been added, and this side has not had phosphorus added. The side that had phosphorus added has a big algae bloom. All that light green is algae that's growing. And so algae blooms can pose a threat to other species. What adds a lot of phosphorus to water is when people use fertilizer on the ground, and the fertilizer with the groundwater runoff, that phosphorus is taken into the nearby waterways and causes those algae blooms. Algae blooms can cause things like fish to die because the algae is taking over the resources of that food chain, and also waste from stockyards can sometimes have a lot of phosphorus in it because of the sewage waste that's going to be going into the water. And so they can cause these algae blooms, and then all the fish die, and then there's not there's a break in the food chain there when you have a whole lot of one species of animals. Nitrogen is important because nitrogen is part of nucleotides and amino acids. So the nitrogen cycle is kind of important. Now, the main reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere, but plants can't use nitrogen from the atmosphere. Plants can't use that gaseous nitrogen. So they have to have bacteria that fix nitrogen, that do nitrogen fixing, which means converting it to forms that the plants can take up. And so nitrogen fixation converts that nitrogen gas to things like ammonia or ammonium not ion, which can then get into the plant, the producers, then the animals, the consumers eat it, and those kinds of things. Now, humans can alter the nitrogen cycle by industrial fixation, and also burning fossil fuels causes what we used to refer to as acid rain. So there's a lot of steps to the nitrogen cycle, so a lot of times the nitrogen cycle seems to be a little bit overwhelming. But essentially, if you hear of nitrogen fixation, that's a way of converting atmospheric nitrogen into a form that the plants can use. And then the consumers eat the plants, waste and remains can go back into the sodium. So this is kind of the essential part of the nitrogen cycle. And then they also show nitrification and denitrification in this figure also. If you focus on kind of the 1, 2, and 3 step here, then you'll get the gist of the nitrogen cycle without the kind of confusing parts about and it includes the nitrogen fixation, but not the nitrification and denitrification, which can sometimes be confusing. And then the last one, which is probably the one that's the most interesting and the most relevant to some people, is the carbon cycle. So carbon is really important because all organic molecules have a carbon backbone. So all of our carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, and even our nucleic acids, have carbon. Producers take up carbon by photosynthesis. So they combine CO2 with sunlight, and that's how they form glucose, and that's where they pick up the carbon. And then the carbon goes through the carbon cycle from the producers to consumers. So we can look at this. They're showing you photosynthesis here. So carbon dioxide gets into the food web by photosynthesis, and then humans give off CO2 by breathing after we make CO2 in our metabolic processes. So CO2 is made in some of the processes that convert glucose to ATP. And so then we breathe out the CO2 after we've made it, and that returns it to the atmosphere. And so this part, I've always thought it was fascinating how plants use a lot of our waste products, especially our waste CO2, to make more oxygen and to make more food energy. And so that's one reason it's good to surround ourselves with plants that convert the waste products into usable oxygen and glucose. But if you make too much of this atmospheric CO2 and you don't have enough photosynthesis taking it out of the atmosphere, then you can disrupt the carbon cycle. And by burning fossil fuels, we release a huge amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And so normally the fossil fuels would not, the carbon would not go from the fossil fuels in the Earth's crust directly to atmospheric carbon. But since we burn fossil fuels to make electricity, to power cars, then it does get converted into CO2 in the atmosphere. And then we're cutting forests, so we decrease the amount of plants that are available to take up the CO2. And so we're getting what's called the greenhouse effect, which is having too much of gases like CO2 in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, also nitrous oxides that are produced by burning fossil fuels. So those are greenhouse gases. And so they can trap heat. We're going to see in just a second why that is. But the excess CO2 can trap heat, and that causes warming of the lower atmosphere. So a lot of people have referred to that as global warming. We kind of use the term global climate change because it can cause various extremes. It does cause warming in some seasons, but then that can cause a cyclical colding effect in the winter season. So just because winters are really, really cold doesn't mean that global warming isn't happening. We're tending to use the term climate change rather than global warming because we know that the initial effect is the warming, and that can cause lots of seasonal disturbances in all of the seasons. It can cause change in rainfall patterns, can cause things like hurricanes and tsunamis, as well as cause a change in the average temperature. So that's why the term global climate change takes into account not just when the temperature goes up or the immediate warming that occurs because of this, but the long-term climate changes that we're seeing. And so this is the figure that your book shows that explains the global warming that occurs, what they call the greenhouse effect, that occurs as a result of having these greenhouse gases. So light energy comes in from sunlight. And normally, heat energy that would go out kind of goes in all different directions. It hits the atmosphere, and it goes in all different directions. And if there's a lot of cloud, that can trap the heat. So the directions that the heat radiates kind of depend on what's in the atmosphere. Now, if we have a lot more greenhouse gas in this atmosphere, then we retain a lot more of this heat in the lower atmosphere rather than that heat radiating out into space. And that heat that gets trapped under those greenhouse gases kind of warms the Earth's surface and the lower atmosphere. And that warming of the atmosphere can have lots of different effects. It can affect rainfall, locations and amounts. It can affect even the water cycle and some of the cycling of water from the ocean to the atmosphere and back. So again, affecting rainfall amounts, but can cause things like increased level and severity of hurricanes, increased level and severity of tsunamis. And so that's kind of the basis of what we're looking at for climate change. It's called the greenhouse effect because those gases trap the heat. Those gases are coming from our disruption of the carbon cycle, the burning of fossil fuels, and the cutting. So what we're doing is we're increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're decreasing the amount of photosynthesis that can get that CO2 into food chains, that can get that CO2 into the primary producers through the chlorophyll and the reactions of photosynthesis. That's where I wanted to go. So we've looked at both of the aspects of this figure. We've looked at the light energy aspects of this, or the energy flow aspects of this figure. Energy flows from light energy to become energy in chemical bonds, and then it's given off as heat energy. And we've also looked at the nutrients part of this. The carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle, and how those nutrients cycle between producers, consumers, and the environment. And so we've broken apart kind of looking at the energy aspect, which is a one-way flow of energy, and looking at the materials or the nutrients, which is kind of a cyclical recycling of the materials through those different cycles. And so that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about ecosystems. We talked about producers and consumers, and then we talked about trophic levels. And that was part of our conversation about the energy flow, the one-way energy flow. And then we talked about trophic bioaccumulation and nutrient cycling through some of those, the water cycle or the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle and the carbon cycle. So I think that's it. I think that's all that part of 17. So I'm going to probably put a couple of announcements up. One is going to be about how Module 7 discussion board will be available for extra credit. The other one will have some information about a study guide for the final. Somebody did ask me about a study guide for the final. I'm going to go in and change the settings on the midterm so that everybody will be able to see the questions they missed and the correct answers on test 1 is already set that way, I believe, but I'm going to check on it. And also the midterm, so that you can use those questions for studying if you want to go back and look at some of those questions for studying. And then I'm going to try to put a list of topics together to be kind of a study guide for the final exam. The final exam is going to be cumulative. The last test will be over just the last 2 months done since the midterm. But then I'll take questions off the first test, questions off the midterm, and questions off the second test to be on the final. So those will be the kind of questions that you'll see will be similar to the questions that you had on all the other tests. And I'm going to put that in the study guide also. So you'll see those pop up. Probably all of the grading will be done, and the study guide will be posted by Monday, and then that'll give everybody the time to look over stuff that they need to. So. Other questions that you guys have? Yes, sir.
Now, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Is there going to be, or how many questions are going to be on the final, and is there going to be a time limit?
The final will be arranged very similar to the midterm. My goal was to have both of those weighted the same. So it will be the same number of questions that were on the midterm, and it'll still be, I think I gave everybody an hour and a half to do the midterm. So it'll probably be a similar time frame. Was there, is there an issue with the amount of time? Is that why you were asking about time limit?
No, I think I'm fine with that.
Okay. And the students that need extended time for accommodations can have that extended time, and they just will work on it past the time limit, I just have to always go back and click a button because it signals to me that they took extra time in case I want to count off, a whole bunch of points because people took extra time, which I never do. But some students that have the accommodations, it just signals to me that they took extra time, but that's the way that we get around the extra time is that the students take the time that they've been given. I just have to remember to go in and click it so that the grade shows up so that it doesn't have this big message to me, hey, this person took a whole bunch of extra time. It's like, I know they did, and that was okay. So I just always have to remember to go in and do that, and that's sometimes something I forget, so.
I believe that was my main consideration.
Well, I will, I believe that I did that for the midterm. So I think that anybody that took the extra time, I think that I have cleared all those messages from the midterm. And when I go in today, here in just a couple of minutes, and reset that, you'll not only be able to see the questions that you missed and the correct answers also. So you'll be able to use that more as a study tool. And then I'll make sure that I don't forget to do that for test 2 so that people will have a chance to look at test 2 that same way and use those for study also. I'll make myself a note so I won't forget. Okay, well, I'm actually going to go in and do that right now and check other stuff in the Grade Center that I need. As always, if there's any questions or anything, please feel free to send me an email, and you'll probably see some of those announcements, especially about the extra credit as I get those posted today.